Good morning. Welcome to the 113th Landon Lecture on Public Issues. The Landon Lectures at Kansas State University were established in 1966 by the late Governor Alfred M. Landon, with the goal of bringing the most prominent national and international public leaders to Kansas State University to discuss the most important and pressing issues of the day. Exactly 20 years and 1 day ago, today's speaker gave a Landon lecture entitled Toward a New Republic. Today it is our pleasure to welcome back to the Landon podium former Senator Howard H. Baker, Jr. Before I introduce Senator Baker, let me introduce other members of the platform party. On my left, Dr. Talat Rahman, the President of the Kansas State University Faculty Senate and Professor in the Department of Physics. Next to Talat is Tracy Mann, Kansas State University Student Body President and a senior in agriculture and economics. By the way, Howard was the student body president of the University of Tennessee. On my right, Ed Seaton, chairman of the Landon Patrons and the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Manhattan Mercury. Next to him, Dr. Charles Reagan, the chair of the Landon Lectures and my executive assistant. Before introducing Senator Baker, I would like to recognize in our audience today Governor Bill Graves, possibly the greatest governor for the state of Kansas in the post-World War II era. I am also pleased that our excellent Lieutenant Governor Gary Scheer could be with us today. Gary? I also would like to introduce State Senator Lana Oline. Lana? Here she is. Of course, we are so pleased to welcome our own favorite, a person who has given the state of Kansas and the United States of America an incredible 18 years of public service in the U.S. Senate, and I might add was a first-rate U.S. Senator during her 3 terms, Nancy Landon Kassebaum Baker. See how popular she is? Well, I am so happy that Senator Baker has accepted our persistent invitations to return to the podium. Howard Baker became a U.S. Senator in 1966. He was the first Republican ever popularly elected to the United States Senate from Tennessee, and he won re-election by wide margins in 1972 and 1978. Senator Baker came from a family of public servants. His father and his mother both served in the House of Representatives. His father-in-law, you might remember this, the late Everett Dirksen. You know, $1 million here, $1 million there. It counts up to a lot. Not a billion, just $1 million. Well, Everett Dirksen, of course, was the Republican leader of the U.S. Senate from 1959 to 1969. In 1973, Senator Baker won wide national recognition as the vice chairman of the Senate Watergate Committee. And you remember the summer of 1973 when everybody was glued to the television set. Well, Howard Baker was the vice chairman of that very important committee. He was the keynote speaker at the Republican National Convention in '76 and was a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination in 1980. He also served 2 terms as minority leader and 2 terms as majority leader of the U.S. Senate. He also served as chief of staff for President Ronald Reagan from February of '87 to July of 1988. He received his undergraduate education at the University of the South and Tulane University and his law degree from the University of Tennessee. He also served 3 years in the U.S. Navy during World War II. He's received many awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian award. He also won the Thomas Jefferson Award for greatest public service performed by an elected or an appointed official. He is a highly regarded photographer, and he has received the American Society of Photographers International Award and has been elected to the Photo Marketing Association's Hall of Fame. He has published 3 books, No Margin for Error, Howard Baker's Washington in 1982, and Big South Fork Country in 1993. He now serves on a number of corporate and foundation boards. Senator Baker and Senator Kassebaum were married in December of 1996. Please join me in welcoming Senator Howard Baker Jr. once again to the Landon podium.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the warmth of your welcome. Thank you for the generosity of the introduction. And may I say to the audience and all of those on the platform how pleased I am to be here, to have this opportunity to deliver the Landon Lecture. I would like to begin by saying that when I tried to find a copy of my 1979 speech, I found that my great filing system and my distinguished staff were unable to locate it. The words were not imperishable. But I also found that K-State has a homepage, and the Landon Lecture shares in that, and I was able to call up the speech that I made in 1976 together with all its oratorical flourishes, and the speeches that Nancy made, and the speech that Governor Landon made, initiating and beginning this great series. I must say, I find that to be an extraordinary resource, and I commend those who are responsible for it. It must surely be in the vanguard and must be the cutting edge of academic utilization of the internet. It was truly valuable to me, and I'm sure it will be valuable to many others. So I congratulate the university and those who are responsible for its internet activity. My friends, I'd like to say that the thoroughness of the introduction this morning underscores the fact that I am a very lucky man. I've been fortunate all my life. I was born to a loving family, and by the accident of the calendar, I served in World War II when most of it was over, and I was delivered back to civilian life alive, whole and well. And I was lucky then to be able to gain admission to the University of Tennessee and to graduate and commence practicing law with my father, as he had done with his father before him. And I enjoyed practicing law until I was elected to the United States Senate in 1966, where, as pointed out, I served for 18 years, and 8 of those years either as minority or majority leader. But I was also fortunate, my friends, to return once more to private life at a time of my choosing and under my own power. Not everyone does that. A short time after that, I was asked by President Reagan to become his chief of staff, and I did so in 1987 and 1988, and I count that as an extraordinary experience in my life and a most fortunate one. I'd known Ronald Reagan for a long time. He was elected governor of California in 1966, at the same time I was elected to the United States Senate. So we knew each other, as politicians do. But it wasn't until I served with him or under him at the White House as his chief of staff that I came to understand the true dimensions of this great man. And following that service, I returned once more to private life, to my profession, and my friends, I've never been luckier or more fortunate than when I married Nancy. A lot has changed since Alf Landon's speech. He described the Cold War as peace based on fear. Since then, we've seen the end of the Cold War, an impeachment trial of a sitting president. We've witnessed the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, the emerging unification of Europe, a time of economic turmoil around the world. When Senator Nancy Kassebaum spoke of the intersection of hope and doubt in our country, she was accurately portraying the complex opportunities and dangers that confronted us and still do. Today, I'd like to talk about two things. First, the institutional structures and framework of our government. I think it's very unlikely that our talented young founding fathers at the ending part of the 18th century could have understood how relevant the structures of government they gave us would be to the 20th and 21st centuries. It is truly a remarkable system. There has probably never been a more sensitive and resonant system of government than that which we enjoy today. It has withstood the challenges to our independence, to the internal strife of a civil war, the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, and the Cold War. For more than 2 centuries, the citizens of the United States have exercised sovereign authority. They have instructed their government in remarkable and successful ways. And sometimes our decisions have produced conflicts, but in every instance, it has led to a stronger and better country. Sometimes we're embarrassed, as in Teapot Dome and Watergate, but we learn from each of them. We've certainly learned that our best efforts at self-government are never perfect and almost always require significant change and mid-course correction as we go forward in the national experience. Recently, I testified before a Senate committee on the renewal of the Independent Counsel Act and whether it should be reauthorized before it expires by its terms in June or permitted to expire. In my view, the Independent Counsel Act, which was adopted in the wake of Watergate, was well-intentioned, artfully structured, and is now essentially unworkable. In the wake of Watergate, we also adopted the War Powers Act, which calls into question the President's rights as Commander-in-Chief to commit troops without congressional approval and upsets the constitutional balance of power. We also passed the Ethics in Government Act, which so often creates distortions in personal relationships, bizarre interpretations, and impossible to enforce. And then the campaign finance reform legislation, also passed in the wake of Watergate. A bill which has simply proven that it does not work, is riddled with loopholes, and it too requires extensive mid-course correction and overhaul. My friends, I hope we've learned that we cannot govern ourselves with laws that are simply well-intended and cleverly titled. It is clear to me that we cannot rely solely on laws, for that matter, to govern our society. And now, as we're about to enter the regular presidential and congressional election cycle, indeed the campaign has already begun, I hope that we've learned that we must rely on the character of our leaders and on our ability to judge them before we elect them. My friends, I'd like to give you now a description of what I think a good president is or ought to be. And it's based on my own experience in Congress, in the White House, but most important, from the vantage point and more detached point of view of a private citizen. I've thought a lot about this. I've seen a lot of presidents in the course of my career. And as my good friend Jim Pearson said once, former Senator Jim Pearson, I don't know how many presidents I've used up. I've given it a lot of thought. There is no firm formula, but these are the thoughts that occur to me. First and foremost, a candidate must be genuine and honest. He must be what a country expects when they choose him, and must not turn out to be something entirely different. Second, if he is elected, he must know exactly who he is. He or she is the President of the United States, the head of state, the head of one of the three bodies of our government. He is the leader of the free world. And he or she will not succeed if there is difficulty in comprehending and accepting the enormity of these responsibilities. We have had presidents, in my view, who never fully understood who they were. Third, the president must know what he or she believes. It's a little late to establish a political philosophy after you occupy the Oval Office. Most successful presidents, including Ronald Reagan, had always had a simple but well-defined set of core beliefs. In Reagan's case, he felt that the country was overtaxed, overregulated, that private initiative could create wealth at such a rate that it could eliminate at least the most dire consequences of poverty and suffering, and that America should remain so strong militarily and resolute diplomatically that no one would ever dare to seriously challenge us. My friends, that's not a bad formula. Fourth, a president must know where he wants to lead the country. Not even the most popular and talented chief executive is capable of leading this government and this country of 240 million toward every objective that might be visualized. He must choose and choose well, but choose a few things that he thinks that he can accomplish. And finally, my friends, the president must be aware that we live in a dangerous time and a dangerous neighborhood. He or she must understand that there is no clear-cut formula for how he must lead this country. For I feel it is perhaps not an overstatement to say that the world today is a more dangerous place since the end of the Cold War than it was before. I have a greater fear of loose nukes in the hands of uncertain leadership, not only in Russia, but perhaps in half a dozen other countries, than I do of any other single factor. We do still live in a nuclear age, and there is still cataclysmic danger. And that is the second issue that I'd like to discuss, and especially about my concerns about the Soviet Union. Today, Russia is arguably more dangerous to the security of the United States than at any time in our mutual history. Security can be best defined through predictability. Think about personal safety. If you can safely predict where you can walk and when, taking into account the likely response of others around you to mug you or leave you alone, you will judge your personal safety and actions accordingly. Terrorism terrifies because it's unpredictable. Just when nobody expects it, a bomb goes off in the World Trade Center or the Oklahoma City courthouse. And so too with international relations. Soviet-American relations in the period after the 1917 revolution, and especially in the Cold War era, were, if anything, predictable. The Russians and Americans learned to live together in a time of mutual terror. Surely the world is a better place for having vanquished an empire that repressed human rights and bullied small countries. But we miss the point if we do not understand that we have entered a mercurial era, a time when world economies and politics are nothing if not unstable. And instability, unpredictability is the key ingredient of danger. Today, Russia is headless. Boris Yeltsin could barely walk to and from his car at King Hussein's funeral. The entire economic system in Russia, once so ballyhooed by foreign investors as the emerging market, lies in ruins. Russia has defaulted on domestic and foreign debt. But why do we care? Because a headless Russia, still the largest country on earth with almost as many nuclear weapons as the United States, is isolated and frightened. And that's not the Russia that we want to have for our neighbor. Soldiers have not been paid. Food is not shipped to remote coal regions of the country. Nuclear weapons experts and scientists go for months without pay. Nuclear weapons stockpiles are improperly guarded. And no one in the West knows for sure who really has control over nuclear codes, especially if the nation's president, who is supposed to make the final launch decision, is at best enfeebled. Scientists and weapons merchants determined to eat and secure their future sell their knowledge and wares to other countries. And whether or not Russia remains a cohesive country, we know from history and from physics that power abhors a vacuum. I see two pessimistic scenarios for Russia, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first, that Russia continues to drift with no leadership and no real hope of early access to economic support from the community of nations. Or second, a strong man appears on the horizon, determined to reunite a fractious nation. The result, a militarized, embarrassed, poor, nationalistic Russia, which has far less to lose by using force in conflicts than did its superpower Soviet predecessor, which in the final analysis sought to maintain the status quo. And this unhappy scenario I call the Siberian Colonel, for indeed the authoritarian leader who might try to put that program into effect most likely will be someone that the West never heard of. That's why in 1990 and 1991, it seems to me that we celebrated a bit too ostentatiously at the end of the Cold War and our victory. But there are other prospects for Russia, and some less menacing. But if people do not eat and do not feel allegiance to a state which does nothing for them, what do they have to lose? Those are dangerous people whom we cannot easily control through normal politics and dialogue, especially when we do not even know with whom to talk or who, if anyone, is ultimately in control. It is for these reasons that I feel we must engage Russia fully and regularly, knowing that we bear a certain responsibility for the economic destruction which put the country into its current shape. We shovel money into the country thinking we could create a capitalist Western democracy, and it did not. Russia is dangerous not because of ideology, but because of lack of leadership and ballast. Our national job in the coming months and years must be to help bring stability to Russia, and sooner rather than later bring Russia and the world together. So finally, we live in an uncertain world with the intersection of uncertain hopes and doubts. We are the beneficiaries of the greatest governing system ever devised by the mind of man. It is relevant to our time and to the future. It has capably produced great leadership for our country and for the rest of the world. We are faced now with great political decisions at home and must deal with great political and military decisions in the rest of the world. And as I remarked in the speech I made in this place in 1979, I think it's a little short of disgraceful that such a small proportion of Americans participate in our electoral process, because it is only in that way that we are assured of choosing men and women of caliber to deal with these cataclysmic issues. My friends, these remarks are not meant to terrify nor to frighten, but rather to say that America is uniquely suited and qualified to face the future with the best political system, the strongest economy, the brightest young generation, the most fastidious care for liberty at home and abroad, and a demonstrated willingness to lead. But all of these things can be brought to bear only if our country is a full participant in the sovereign exercise. So, my friends, there are challenges before us. There are dangers to be met. And there isn't but one way that you and I can do it as private citizens, and that is fully to participate in the political process. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Take the questions.
Yeah, I'll just indicate that we're going to... That's good. Senator Baker, thank you very much for that excellent presentation. We do have time for questions. And please keep in mind that we're looking at a living resource here of American history in the post-World War II period, who was a U.S. Senator during the Vietnam War, was minority and majority leader during the time of the Watergate hearings, was chief of staff for one of our greatest presidents, Ronald Reagan, and then, of course, has been a commentator on CNN during the latest furor. So we have somebody here who can answer questions from just about any time from the 1960s to the present. So with that in mind, do we have somebody over here? Why don't you turn the lights up so we can see?
Why don't I take the question?
Okay, so there will be a question right over here.
Before you ask your question, I should tell you one story. I've mentioned that my dad was a lawyer, and indeed he was, and a good lawyer, and a member of Congress, and a good member of Congress. But when I first got out of law school, and we were talking one day, he said, "Son, you may someday go into public affairs, and if you do, there may be a requirement for questions and answers. And just remember, if you don't like the question you're asked, answer some other question." Now,
That's former State Senator Merle Wirtz. Merle, Senator?
Current ideology. Is there a consistent ideology now in Russia, and if so, how would you define it?
is there a consistent ideology in Russia now, and how would I define it? I find an ideological vacuum in Russia. I used to visit there a good bit because I had small investments in Russia, which I've now liquidated, but before they liquidated them for me. But I don't find any political formula at all that has popular and mass appeal in Russia. They are living from hand to mouth. It is largely a barter society. Those who have money, more often than not, export it promptly to Switzerland and other places. There's very little investment in the infrastructure, almost no reinvestment in their industry, commerce, and business by Russians. And honestly, most of the aid that we send to Russia under the present system ends up going into the pockets of others. I don't know what they have for a political philosophy. The Russians are still attracted to communism, and that's a very large fraction of the Duma, their parliament. But it seems clear to me they don't want to go back to an authoritarian communist regime. But they do not respond well to a capitalist free market economy system. So I don't really know what's finally going to happen. That's why I have fear of the Siberian Colonel. I don't think anybody will stand chaos forever. And the Russian people have a history and a tradition of finally coming together with an authoritarian regime. And my guess is that's what they'll do again. And they may reestablish economic order, and they may make the trains run on time, and they may provide shelter and food for most of the inhabitants. But when they do, look out, because I think we may be in real danger then, because they are humiliated by their defeat. They are angry with the world, and with the United States in particular, for trying to impress on them a capitalist system. And if they do go the authoritarian route, we're going to have our hands full. And I have high hopes that we'll manage that. But bear in mind that in a nuclear age, we're dealing with a deck of cards that have never really been played. And I don't know how that's finally going to work out. That's another scenario of gloom and doom, but you asked the question, and that's what I really think.
Now we'll move over here.
Mr. Baker, I have kind of two questions that are kind of related. But since you say that the American capitalist Western system isn't working in Russia and that we've been trying to force that, but it hasn't been happening, what would you think about, or do you think a true communist under the actual Marxist principles, could that reemerge in Russia? And also, why are you so pessimistic that you believe the only type of leadership that could come into Russia would be this Siberian colonel, a militaristic version, rather than perhaps a Siberian Gandhi or something?
Well, it might be, but my guess is that the first step in trying to bring order out of chaos in Russia is to get rid of the corruption and to get rid of those who are on the take. And they are running the place right now. Democratic concepts in Russia may take hold. They have not yet taken hold. And I very much hope that we can foster the cause of democracy in Russia, but I also very much hope that we'll recognize that at some point, democracy in the U.S. mold is not likely to be fully adaptable to the Russian Republic. I guess I finally think that there's about a 50-50 chance that Russia can be restored to some sort of orderly process, and about a 50-50 chance that it won't, and that it'll simply dissolve into a variety of smaller nations. But I think there's less than a 50-50 chance that we're going to see a democratic Russia in the sense that we know it in the next decade or so.
And then we have a question over here.
Senator Baker, I'd like to thank you for being here and thank you for the service to the country, not only in the Senate but also in World War II. I'd also like to say that I think our K-State Wildcat football team could take your volunteers any day.
It's been pointed out to me that except for one play, anyway, go ahead.
My question is one of my personal heroes is Ronald Reagan, and I saw a bill introduced to the House of Representatives to put his face on Mount Rushmore, and I was curious of what you thought about that. I'm all for it.
I really don't think that's a good idea. First of all, I don't think there's any room on Mount Rushmore, and number two, I think if Ronald Reagan were able to respond to that himself, he would be appalled at the idea. I'm not even sure he would approve of naming Washington National Airport after him, but he's really essentially a pretty modest man. And I don't think he'd like that much, and I certainly don't think his family would like it much. Nancy and I had an opportunity to visit with Nancy Reagan in California just a few weeks ago when I was out there speaking to a forum at the Reagan Library, which, by the way, is a magnificent place, and you ought to visit if you ever have the opportunity. But she reports that President Reagan is doing well, physically, and that he probably is not doing so well otherwise. But she is upbeat, and we all wish him well. You know, it's a shame. It's really a shame that he should endure this in his final years. But I want to tell you, I'm very high on Ronald Reagan. As I said in my remarks, I thought I knew him well before I went to the White House, but I really didn't know him very well at all. If you'll let me, I might digress for a minute and tell you how I got to be Chief of Staff. You might enjoy that. Anyway, one thing that was mentioned in the remarks that I appreciate was that I ran for the Republican presidential nomination in 1980, because unless you play Trivial Pursuit, you would not remember that I ran for president in 1980. But especially for the young men and women in the audience, I should tell you that if you ever run for president, you contract a terrible illness. And that illness manifests itself by waking up on some morning and thinking, I cannot live another day if I don't run for president again. And I had an attack of that in February of 1987, and it was so bad that I took my family to Florida to have a conference about my running for president again in 1988. And that conversation ran down awfully fast. Nobody wanted to talk about it but me. And for the lack of something better to do, I took my then 8-year-old grandson to the zoo in Miami. And while we were at the zoo, President Reagan called in the conversation, "Where is Howard?" Howard's at the zoo. And Ronald Reagan said, "Wait till he sees the zoo I got in mind for him." But to make a long story short, he asked me to come to Washington the next day, and I assumed he wanted me to do something in the Reagan administration, since February of '87 was really not the high point in the Reagan presidency with Iran-Contra and talk of impeachment and all those things. So I marshaled all my arguments for what I couldn't do, whatever it was he wanted me to do. I was at the moment he called thinking about my own political future. I'd spent all those years in government. I'd retired and I just couldn't do it, whatever it was he wanted me to do. And I was met at National Airport by a White House car, and they took me to the southwest gate of the complex and up through the diplomatic reception room entrance to the little elevator that goes up to the 3rd floor where we keep presidents. And the elevator door opened, and there stood Ronald Reagan, who said, "Howard, I've got to have a new chief of staff, and I'd like you to do it." And I heard myself say, "All right." That's how I got to be chief of staff. But I got to know him awfully well and enjoyed most days. He had an endless stock of funny stories. And sometimes I thought that my greatest danger was that I was going to run out of funny stories before he did. But it came out a dead heat. Okay.
There's Professor Lemon Baker over there.
Are you Professor Baker?
I think so.
Where are your Bakers from?
They're from Tennessee and
Really?
Kentucky. Yeah,
Where?
they had come from Virginia before that, and then they went to Missouri.
Well, we're probably related, and we'll wait to see how the questions go before we...
Well, I'll give you a chance here to pick a different one. Remember at the beginning you cited 4 post-Watergate pieces of legislation that you thought were due for mid-course correction or overhaul, and they were the Independent Counsel Act, the War Powers Act, the Ethics in Government Act, and then the Campaign Finance Reform legislation. And I'd like you to speak, if you would, a little bit more in detail about what your sense is of what would be useful in the area of campaign finance reform legislation. But if you want to answer another question, you can pick one of the other 3.
Well, you know, it's a dangerous thing for me to do, Professor, since my wife is in the vanguard of the call for campaign finance reform, and but she and I have had breakfast table conversations about this. I wrote a book back in the 80s called No Margin for Error that set out in some detail what I thought it ought to be, and it was an instant failure. I went into Amazon.com, and you know, they list everything published, and then they list how often they've had requests for it. And I quickly turned off the computer because I think, as far as I could tell, there were fewer requests for my book than any other book they ever had in stock. But in essence, what I say is this, and what I still believe. I think disclosure is the great antiseptic of the American political system. And I suppose there has to be some sort of limitation on the amount of campaign contributions, but I'm really not sure. You know, how much is contributed by a particular individual or aggregation of individuals to a particular candidate is really a political question. And that is, do you think he's more or less suitable for the office he or she seeks because of those contributions or not? Are they subject to undue influence because of those contributions? But that is essentially really a political judgment, not a legal judgment. So really, I think these things. One, I don't think you ought to be able to contribute anything unless you can vote for that candidate. And if you'll think about that for a minute, that's going to shut out a whole lot of things. There'd be no PACs. There'd be no contributions from labor unions. There'd be no soft money or corporate contributions. Unless you can vote for that candidate, you should not be able to contribute to that candidate. The Supreme Court's held, I think correctly, that political contributions are a form of free speech, of political speech. And I don't want to see that truncated at all. That leaves unanswered the question what you do about somebody who's got a lot of money of their own. And that's a big problem right now. But as long as the Supreme Court sticks with Buckley versus Vallejo decisions, there's nothing you can do about that. But I think disclosure, finally, timely disclosure, is the real answer to the whole dilemma. And by timely disclosure, I've always thought you ought to cut off all contributions, say 2 weeks before the election, and require candidates to publish in a newspaper of general circulation who contributed what. And then you can't contribute anything more for 2 weeks before the election. So people can examine those things and make a judgment on whether that was a good thing to receive those contributions or not. That's sort of what I think. And I think nobody listened to me when I was majority leader, and they're not likely to listen to me now. But Governor Graves is showing some agreement there, and if he's got a question, I'll be glad to take that.
If I can follow up, what about independent expenditure?
I think independent expenditures aren't. And I think independent expenditure, that's a tough issue though, Governor, it really is, because sometimes there are issues that transcend candidates. And I don't know how you cut that off or how you deal with that, because but I would be willing, for my part, to make the sacrifice and say if you can't vote for that candidate, you can't contribute anything that's going to have an impact on that candidacy. So that would eliminate independent expenditures. As I say, these are radical views, and nobody's going to pay any attention to them, but I love to say them because I have become recklessly frank since I left government office, and I find a thrill and exhilaration for saying these things that nobody's going to pay any attention to, but that's what I think.
Okay, here's one over here on the right.
Sir, with the rising tensions in Bosnia and the potential deployment of U.S. troops to Kosovo, what are your views on U.S. military intervention in regional conflicts?
Well, I think that too is a hard question. I think there are times when the United States must, in good conscience, consider asserting a unilateral intervention in the affairs of other regions of the world, even other countries. But I think those are very rare. And I think that first, second, and third efforts should meet at some sort of multinational, multilateral approach to these problems. Now, in the Kosovo situation and others in that region, this is reckless too, but you know, essentially that's a European matter. And we ought to require NATO to take control of that issue. And we ought to say, look, we're going to be around, and if you need any help, let us know, but this is a European matter. And how about keeping us posted on how it works out? Now, that is viewed by some as an abdication of world responsibility with the United States, but it also should be viewed as an effort to recognize that other countries over and above the United States also have a responsibility to be guardians of civilization, and that we can't handle the whole thing, and that other groups, if they're going to function and perform, such as NATO and Seaton, should have a first responsibility to deal with these things. I do not say we should totally abdicate all efforts to be helpful or even to act unilaterally in some cases. And I think we should make a conscious, determined effort to see that international organizations act first. So that's what I think.
Okay, we'll just go over here to the left.
He actually took my question, but I have another one off of your campaign finance question. When you mentioned disclosure, I'm taking it that you're meaning it just solely in contributions, but I am aware of a bill that has come before the Kansas State Legislature, and I'm not for sure the status of it, concerning disclosure of groups and mailings to individuals. What's your feelings on that? Because as far as like the independent expenditures and stuff like that.
You're speaking of mail solicitations and the like?
Kind of like issue advocacy, and also sometimes end up supporting one candidate over the other, or it could be interpreted as a mailing coming from one candidate against the other, but in all reality it came from a PAC of some sort. What's your feelings on disclosure?
Well, I don't think that, I think disclosure is the antiseptic of the whole system, and if it's properly and accurately reported, then people can make a judgment about that too. I thought you were going to get into the current flap on the sweepstakes matters, and you know, it really is the same ball of wax. It certainly is. Disclosure is still the cornerstone of public honesty, and you don't mean by disclosure a tiny little little sentence buried in a long, convoluted text. It should be disclosure that is timely, recognizable, and relevant. And it applies to the sweepstakes situation just like it applies to the political situation. But you're never going to get anything that's perfect, but you're going to have to in my view, you're going to have to establish cardinal principles that should govern the reform of elections and that should govern us generally in our interaction with the public. You know, today with radio and television, with television in particular, and mass mail, there can be a huge effort that has political consequences that is not related to either political party or to a candidate. And someday we're going to have to take a look at that. But right now I'm willing to just stick with politics, which I know more about than most things. I mentioned Nancy's commitment to campaign finance reform. She and former Vice President Mondale were co-chairman of a committee to take a look at that. And one day she was going down to the White House to meet with the president on this subject, and it was about the time the president was recovering from his knee operation. Well, I've had 2 knee operations, and I had a cane, or rather Nancy had a cane I used that belonged to her father, I guess. But anyway, I said, you know, take this note down to the president. I wrote, "Dear Mr. President, I've had knee surgery and I'm more than ordinarily sympathetic to people who do, and Nancy's bringing a cane and I don't use it anymore. Just remember, things do get better." And we saw him months later at a birthday party for Madeleine Albright, Secretary Albright. A big crowd. And he spotted us across the way and came hobbling over and looked me in the eye and said, "What gets better?" And I didn't have the presence of mind to say it was not meant to be a political statement.
Oh, we have time for one more question.
I kind of have a double question for you. My first one is, earlier in your lecture, you were talking about the unworkability of the Independent Counsel Act. Could you please elaborate on it?
Yes, I will.
And give us some alternatives to it.
Is that the second part, the alternatives?
No, the second part deals with the military. What are your views on military financing, primarily? Because you said that you felt that we must have a strong military, and I'm just wondering how strong.
All right. Let me take them in 2 parts. On the independent counsel statute, as I said in my remarks, I think it was well-intentioned, it was artfully drawn, and was meant to meet the challenges of that time. But like almost everything else in government policy, as time goes by, we find it doesn't work very well, or at least it's got to be changed to meet today's challenges and circumstance. I think that the present act should be permitted to expire in June, which it will do absent a congressional action before that time. And I do think something should take its place. But I think this act has been so pilloried and so criticized and so held up to ridicule and has functioned so poorly in some respects that I think we just ought to wipe the slate clean and start over. Now, I also don't think we ought to do that right away, because I think that passions are running so high and people have such conflicted views of what ought to happen that we ought to let it cool for a while. And that's what I said in my testimony before the Senate Committee, Government Operations Committee, that they ought to let it expire and then wait a while, probably till the next session of Congress, to decide what to do. You're not going to be without any recourse then. The Attorney General of the United States has the authority now, and indeed, to appoint special prosecutors, and indeed the most effective ones that have ever been done were done absent a statute and were done by the Attorney General on his own initiative. And I'm thinking now of the aftermath of Watergate once again. So it's not as if there were no remedies. And what I'm saying is, let's take stock, let's think about it, let's debate it for a while, let's hear what the country thinks about it. Their country is remarkably right. Sometimes it's infuriating, but they are right. And my dad used to tell me also, when I made that remark, he said, well, you know, you can doubt the sovereign's judgment, but you can't doubt their authority. And so it is in the political realm, but I think we ought to just cool it for a little while and wait and see what we think of this thing, say, in 6 months. On the question of the military, yes, I do believe that America should be so militarily strong that no one would be seriously tempted to challenge us. It's a different military now than it was during World War II or during Korea or Vietnam. It's a highly mechanized, very specialized system that has such a focus of destructive ability and such accuracy of its application that it's an entirely different concept. Warfare is different. If anything, it's more like the warfare of the last millennium, when really in the great battles of at the end of the first millennium, they usually had 5,000 or 10,000 people. That was the whole deal. Part of that reason is because the population is so much smaller. But now with mechanization and with the high technology application of weaponry, I think we're getting back to the place where you have much smaller military but more expensive military. And I think we must not ever shortchange our research and development and sometimes our deployment of new weapon systems. That brings to mind the ABM system, an anti-ballistic missile system. That argument has raged for years about whether we should or shouldn't, whether it would be destabilizing or not. Ronald Reagan tried to reach a compromise on that by saying, look, let's go forward with the research, development, and deployment, and we will share our technology with any other nation, because an ABM system is essentially defensive. It really can't attack anybody. It can only defend against attack. But that was shot down, and maybe not for bad reasons, but I do think that we've not seen the end of research and development in military technology, and that our principal commitment of energy and resources, meaning money, should be there, and that our armed forces should be carefully tailored to meet the challenge of a modern war, a modern challenge, and not the last war and the challenges of World War II. So I've always been big on research budgets. I've always been big on early deployment of systems to test them out. I like the idea of fly before you buy, and having parallel demonstrations, say for instance of the F-22 fighter. All these things, I think, are a good operation to see whether or not we're getting our money's worth. But don't shortchange the military, because we do live in a very dangerous world. We live at a time when not just Russia has nuclear weapons, but when there may be 15 countries out there that have nuclear weapons. And if we had a nuclear attack right now by missile on the United States, we might not know where it came from. So we got a lot of work to do on research and development to defend this country, but the emphasis clearly has shifted now in military parlance from offense to defense. And I think we should focus very carefully on it. I hate to keep coming back to these doomsday scenarios, but my friends, let me tell you what, there is nothing more important than survival. And And the United States is a sitting duck for terrorists and for rogue nations. And we've got to recognize that. We can't believe we won the war, and we won the Cold War, and now we can be fat and happy. We can't. And that's why I keep making these terrible speeches. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Howard. That was a great talk and great questions and answers. Thanks. Senator Baker, once again, thank you for your excellent talk here this morning, and certainly I know everybody was thrilled to participate in the questions and answers. I told you it was a treasure house of information, and we could do this all day long, and it would be exhilarating, educational, and exciting. I do want you to know that a week from today, U.S. Senator John McCain from the state of Arizona will be our next Landon speaker. So that's next Monday. What did I say? Oh, today is Tuesday. Okay. Well, next Monday. So I look forward to seeing you here when Senator McCain is here. Senator Baker, thank you again very much. Superb presentation. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, sir.
It was just great. Well, that was just great.